Okay, so here's our hormone video, essentially. So this is going to be talking primarily about hypothalamic hormones and anterior pituitary hormones, because those are the ones that really need the most explaining, I think. And the rest are pretty self-explanatory, with a couple of other little tidbits that I'll throw in. But we're going to spend the bulk of our time on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So let's start. The hypothalamus. We all remember this as a structure in the brain. It is connected to the pituitary gland with a little tube, essentially called the infundibulum, and that leads to the pituitary, both to the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. But what the hypothalamus does is a bunch of things. One, it controls the adrenal medulla. Here we're talking about the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys, and the medulla of those would be the inside. Anytime you have the medulla of an organ, it's like the inside area, where the cortex would be like the outer shell. So coming out of the adrenal medulla, you'll find the adrenalins, epinephrine and norepinephrine. You've seen those used as neurotransmitters, but in this case they're going to be used as hormones because they're going into the blood. And they'll have a fight or flight, a sympathetic effect on your body. Now, the hypothalamus also makes something called releasing hormones. And when we have a releasing hormone, we just say the name of whatever the hormone it's stimulating and then put a -RH for releasing hormone after it. We'll see examples in a minute. But these releasing hormones are going to go down through the infundibulum, through capillaries. And those capillaries in the infundibulum are called the hypophyseal portal system. They go to the anterior pituitary, and the releasing hormones are released from that capillary system, and they stimulate the cells in the anterior pituitary to make anterior pituitary hormones. Now, the hypothalamus can also turn off production of anterior pituitary hormones or slow it down using inhibiting hormones. And for that, we just use the name of the hormone with an IH for inhibiting hormone afterwards. These are going to also take the hypophyseal portal system down to the infundibulum, get down to the anterior pituitary, but they're inhibiting the cells there, which is why they're called inhibiting hormones. So releasing hormones from the hypothalamus stimulate the anterior pituitary, inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus inhibit the anterior pituitary. We're going to come back to these too, especially these, but let's take a little detour to the rest of the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, where in the hypothalamus we make two hormones directly called ADH and oxytocin. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. This helps to raise your blood pressure. It works along with aldosterone, which we saw a little bit about aldosterone in previous lectures, which helps also to raise your blood pressure by reabsorbing sodium and water at the kidneys. So anytime you reabsorb sodium and water with the kidneys, you're going to raise your blood pressure. Oxytocin is something that has to do with childbirth. It causes smooth muscle contractions around the uterus to cause childbirth. It causes the release of milk. You may also have heard of this as the love hormone. It gets in your brain and it causes feelings of love, which are handy right after childbirth, to love the baby, right? So oxytocin is that hormone. So ADH and oxytocin made in the hypothalamus in two very particular places, the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. Both are made there in those two places. And they're going to go down through the infundibulum, not using the hypophyseal portal system this time, but they're going to be using the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. These are axons. So the cell bodies that are making these are found up in the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus in the hypothalamus. The axons go down using this hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract down to the infundibulum, and then the axon terminals, so the synaptic knobs, are releasing the ADH and oxytocin straight from the posterior pituitary. Okay. And then here we have the effects listed down there. So we already said those. ADH causes you to reabsorb sodium and water in the kidneys to raise your blood pressure. and oxytocin helps with childbirth and also love. And here's a picture just to illustrate where we have the hypothalamus up here. Here's the infundibulum up here in the front, anterior pituitary, back here in the back, the posterior pituitary. So we'll do the green first. This would be maybe the paraventricular nucleus or the supraoptic nucleus, making a neuron in there, making ADH or oxytocin, travels down and is released straight out of the posterior pituitary through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Now for the releasing hormones and the inhibiting hormones, they take a different path through the infundibulum. They're going through the hypophyseal portal system to get to cells in the anterior pituitary where they'll either stimulate them or inhibit them. Okay, so this chart is dealing with a chart that's in your notes. Actually, it's dealing with two charts that are in your notes, and I've put them together. I think that this will help it make a little bit more sense if you look at it this way, all in one, rather than having them separated. So I'll explain this so that we can all be on the same page. But in this column here, we have the releasing hormone. So we have these releasing hormones that are coming out of the hypothalamus, going down through the hypophyseal tract, or the hypophyseal portal system into the anterior pituitary. And they will stimulate the anterior pituitary. When those hormones get to the anterior pituitary, they're going to bind to a receptor, and they're going to cause the production of a second messenger. This would be the second messenger that they would use. So let me find that set of notes for that. Let's say we're looking at this first one, which we're going to get into. It uses phospholipase C as a second messenger. This one is called thyrotropin releasing hormone, or you could also call it thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. They both mean the same thing. Thyro or thyroid, they're both talking about the thyroid gland, so that's going to be the eventual target. Tropin just means like growth or production of, so same as stimulating hormone. So every time you see a tropin, you know it's going to have to do with some sort of stimulation. So they're both very descriptive. Thyroid stimulating hormone is eventually going to be the anterior pituitary hormone that goes and stimulates the thyroid. But first we need to cause the production of thyroid stimulating hormone. So the hypothalamus makes thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. That goes down through the hypophyseal portal system, through the infundibulum, gets into the anterior pituitary. Let's say this is an anterior pituitary cell. Thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone binds here to this receptor, activates the G protein, activates phospholipase C. All this stuff with inositol triphosphate diacylglycerol happens, eventually creating protein kinase C that stimulates the cell. And in this case, what it's going to stimulate the cell to make is thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin. Now that hormone, so thyrotropin comes out and it goes to the thyroid gland, so it gets in the blood, it travels through the blood until it hits the thyroid gland, where it will interact with cells in the thyroid gland. Now for this one, thyroid stimulating hormone is going to use CAMP as its second messenger. So here's thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. It binds to the receptor, activates the G protein, activates the adenylyl cyclase, it turns ATP into CAMP, and stimulates the cell. And now in this case, this is a thyroid cell, and what thyroid cells do is they make two hormones, T3 and T4. So that's the whole process right there. So we had our releasing hormone go to the anterior pituitary, trigger this second messenger system. Then once that second messenger system stimulated the cell, it caused the production of this anterior pituitary hormone. So the anterior pituitary cells made this anterior pituitary hormone, which goes out into the blood, gets to the thyroid gland. When it hits the cells in the thyroid gland, it triggers the production of CAMP, so it stimulates the thyroid cells with CAMP, and it causes them to make the hormones that they make, which are T3 and T4. Okay, so that's not so bad, right? We've got a few steps. A hormone from the hypothalamus, what's its second messenger? We have a hormone from the anterior pituitary that this hormone from the hypothalamus caused to be produced by using that second messenger. Then we're following this anterior pituitary hormone out to its target. There's its target over there. And here's the second messenger that it uses to stimulate its target. And this is the end result. This is the end product made by the final target here. So we can just go through the rest of these pretty quickly. Once you understand that first system, it all just sort of makes sense. The next releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, corticotropin releasing hormone. Cortico is referring to the adrenal cortex. Tropin means, stimulating. So it's going to eventually, in the end, the target is going to be the adrenal cortex. So corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus goes down through the hypophyseal portal system into the anterior pituitary, and it causes that cell in the anterior pituitary to make phospholipase C. That's the second messenger. It stimulates that cell to make that cell make adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, adrenal cortex stimulation hormone, essentially. So adrenocorticotropic hormone gets into the blood, goes down to the adrenal cortex, to the outer shell of the adrenal gland. When it hits cells in the adrenal cortex, it stimulates the production of CAMP as a second messenger and causes those cells to make whatever it is that they make. In some cases it's testosterone, in other cases it's cortisol. Aldosterone is made by the adrenal cortex, and it is slightly triggered by ACTH, but there is another mechanism for triggering aldosterone or for stimulating aldosterone that's more important, so we'll see that. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin, that's referring to the gonad, that's going to be the eventual target. So gonadotropin releasing hormone comes out of the hypothalamus, goes down through the hypophyseal portal system, hits the anterior pituitary, uses phospholipase C as a second messenger, and causes that cell in the anterior pituitary to make the gonadotropins. These are two hormones, LH, or luteinizing hormone, and FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. These have differing effects depending on whether we're talking about male or female, what exactly their effect will be. But they're going to get into the blood. They leave the anterior pituitary, get into the blood, go to the ovaries or the testes. They use CAMP as their second messenger, and they can cause follicle development. So that would be in the case of follicle stimulating hormone. Testosterone stimulation, that would again be follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone is responsible for the formation of the corpus luteum, ovulation, things like that. So that's the process there. Prolactin releasing hormones come from the hypothalamus, uses phospholipase C as a second messenger when it binds to receptors in the anterior pituitary, stimulates them to make prolactin, which can be abbreviated as PRL. Prolactin comes out of the anterior pituitary, goes to the mammary glands. When it binds to receptors in the mammary glands, it triggers the production of CAMP, so the second messenger uses CAMP. And it doesn't cause the production of a hormone, but what it does is it causes the development of the mammary glands. In a male, it's not quite certain exactly what prolactin does, and there is a much lesser amount of prolactin in the male. Growth hormone releasing hormone comes out of the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary. This one's different. It uses CAMP as a second messenger, but it triggers the production of growth hormone. Growth hormone from the anterior pituitary goes out into the blood. It goes to the entire body. It's second messenger. This is one we're going to have to go over because this is not really a second messenger exactly. It's a whole different system called the Jak-stat system. Again, no hormone is created due to growth hormone. It just causes growth. It makes your cells grow. And then the last releasing hormone, melanotropin releasing hormone, or you could call it melanocyte stimulating hormone. That's coming out of the hypothalamus, uses phospholipase C as a second messenger, causes the anterior pituitary to make melanotropin, or melanocyte stimulating hormone, which goes out into the blood, goes through melanocytes. Melanocytes are skin cells that have color. They're responsible for the color of your skin, so this would stimulate the color production or the melanin production in your skin, but really only when you are a fetus, so before birth, or lizards, fish, other types of animals still use melanocyte stimulating hormone after birth. After you have your base skin tone and you're grown, this is not really in effect. But while it is still in effect, it uses CAMP as a second messenger to cause the production of melanin. So this looks like a whole lot of stuff, but there is a pattern here. If you just look at the releasing hormones, all of their second messengers are phospholipase C, except for growth hormone releasing hormone. So if on the test I say, what is the second messenger used by prolactin releasing hormone or thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone, or really any of them except for growth hormone, you would just say phospholipase C. So you just have to remember phospholipase C for all of the releasing hormones except for growth hormone. That uses CAMP. Now we'll take a look at the anterior pituitary hormones in this column right here, and then look at their second messengers. You'll see down the line, CAMP, 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 all the way down, except for, again, growth hormone. That uses that Jak-stat thing that we're about to talk about. So all of the releasing hormones, except for growth hormone releasing hormone, use phospholipase C as a second messenger. All of the anterior pituitary hormones, except for growth hormone, use CAMP as a second messenger. So always growth hormone releasing hormone will be the exception to the rule. Okay. Okay, so let's just look at this as a picture form. So this is just going to walk through this. You're probably getting really sick of this whole topic here, but we're almost done. We're going to walk through this top line here by picture. So here's thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone coming out of the hypothalamus, going down through the hypophyseal portal system into the anterior pituitary. There's an anterior pituitary cell. There's the receptor for thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. When thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone binds to that receptor, it causes that second messenger system of phospholipase C to stimulate the cell to create thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone diffuses out, gets into the blood, it ends up in the cells in the thyroid, which are called the follicular cells, which you'll have seen in lab hopefully by now. They're responsible for making the cells in the thyroid. So thyroid stimulating hormone binds to the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor on the follicular cells in the thyroid, triggers CAMP as a second messenger, stimulates the cell to make T3 and T4, which are the thyroid hormones. Okay, now the rest of this is going to be pretty straightforward. Just clearing up some loose ends. So for our inhibiting hormones, we have two inhibiting hormones instead of the million that we just saw of releasing hormones. And it's important to note really just that these don't have to act directly opposite of the releasing hormone. So if the releasing hormone uses CAMP as a second messenger, we don't have to directly work opposite CAMP. We can inhibit the cell in any way we want. Just like if you think of, there's all different sorts of ways that you can stimulate your own self. Like you could use caffeine or a nap or I don't know, any other way you can think of. And chocolate has a little bit of a stimulatory effect. So there are all these different ways that you could stimulate your own body. And there's all kinds of different ways that you could inhibit your body then if you take away your nap, or you take away your caffeine, or you take away your chocolate. All of those could cause you to slow down some. So it's the same with these cells. Just because the releasing hormone uses phospholipase C or uses CAMP doesn't mean we have to act exactly opposite to it. So just keep that in mind. So growth hormone inhibiting hormone. This is also called somatostatin, which if you look at the word in Latin, it just says exactly this. Soma means body, statin means stay the same. If you're not growing, you're staying the same, so somatostatin. So what this hormone does is it blocks adenylyl cyclase in the anterior pituitary cell. So it does block CAMP. If you don't have adenylyl cyclase, you can't make CAMP. But it also blocks the inflow of calcium. So that's another way that the cell can be using to produce its hormone. So if we block that inflow of calcium, we can't stimulate the cell that way. So it's going to inhibit growth hormone, and it's going to inhibit thyroid stimulating hormone. Dopamine is something that is used in the brain as a neurotransmitter a lot. It's used in your digestive, it's used all over the place. But it's also used as an inhibiting hormone by the hypothalamus, and it too blocks adenylyl cyclase. So it blocks the production of CAMP, and it inhibits prolactin production. Now, we mentioned Jak-stat. We said that that's not really a second messenger system. It's not got a G protein involved with the receptor, so it's not G protein coupled, but this is what growth hormone uses as a way of stimulating the cell that it's trying to make grow. So what Jak-stat stands for is Janus kinase signal transducer and activator of transcription, which is a mouthful. But what it means, kinase, like an enzyme. Janus, that was like a Roman god, I think. He was either Roman or Greek. It doesn't matter, really. He just two-faced. He had like a face sticking off this way. Like there's one face. I draw terribly. And then there's another face over here. Like that. That was what the god looked like, Janus. So essentially what this means is that this enzyme has like a side over here and a side over here. And they're kind of like opposite looking of each other. Signal is just referring to the fact that, growth hormone is a signal coming from an anterior pituitary cell to this particular cell somewhere in the body. Transducer is like what you have in like a radio or a TV, where you take radio waves or TV waves and you convert them into sound or picture. It's how you change whatever the signal is into something that you can understand, because like you can't look at a radio wave and hear it, you have to change it. So this is changing that hormone signal into something the cell can understand. And what it's going to do then is it's going to activate transcription, which is production of proteins, making cellular structures, making the cell grow. So what happens is growth hormone binds to the growth hormone receptor on the cell. It activates the Janus kinase, that's the Jak part of Jak-stat, and the Jak part of Jak-stat activates the stat part of Jak-stat. So the Janus kinase activates the signal transducer and activator of transcription. The stat part, it goes into the nucleus, stimulates transcription, out come the proteins, and the cells grow. So that's the Jak-stat method. Okay, so last page here. So insulin-like growth factors. This has to do with growth hormone. This would be synergistic with growth hormone. When hormones are synergistic with each other, it means that they work together, they have similar effects, they help each other. And what these IGFs or insulin-like growth factors are things that are made by the cells in the liver, which are called hepatocytes, when growth hormone is active on those hepatocytes. And they're going to work together with growth hormone to cause cell growth. The cells make protein. They especially target your skeletal muscle and chondrocytes, so cartilage cells. And this is called anabolism, or anabolic effects, when you're causing a cell to grow. But these anabolic effects would happen even on cancerous cells. So if you have too many IGFs, it's very possible to trigger overproduction of cancer cells because of too many IGFs. So another downfall of having too many IGFs would be that these act as competitive antagonists to insulin receptors. So when you have an antagonist to a hormone, it means that it works opposite of each other. If it's competitive, it means that it does a really good job of it. So essentially what it's doing here, what these IGFs do, they block insulin receptors. And what insulin is trying to do is allow sugar, glucose, to go into the cell. So if you block that, you're not able to get sugar into the cell and you're not able to use it for energy. Now, normally, if you just have normal amounts of growth hormone in your body, you have normal amounts of IGF, so you don't have this like terrible anabolic effect on cancerous cells, and you don't have this problem with overly blocking your insulin receptors, because you just have a normal amount of IGFs. But if you have too many IGFs, you end up over blocking the insulin receptor. So having symptoms similar to, diabetes mellitus, where your insulin receptors don't work. Here they're being blocked by something, but it's the same end effect. Insulin can't work. And then any cancerous cells would be being overstimulated, which you don't want any stimulation of cancerous cells. So how do you get too many IGFs? It would be by having external, or what we would call exogenous, growth hormone. So exogenous is anything that your body doesn't make, that you take in some way. So, sometimes certain competitive athletes might take growth hormone because, these IGFs and growth hormone too target skeletal muscle, making them stronger, making them have more endurance, all that sort of thing. So not a good idea because you're going to end up with too many IGFs. Also, there's things which you'll see in the slides about, sometimes dairy when they have, dairy cows and they give them bovine growth hormone. That causes the cows to make IGFs, and then it ends up in the milk, and then you end up ingesting that. So that can also be a source of extra IGFs. Okay, and then the last little topic here, the renin-angiotensin system. Renin is something that is made in the kidneys, and it's made when your blood pressure is low, so you want to raise it up. So renin is going to work together or be synergistic with ADH and aldosterone. And why it's especially synergistic with aldosterone is that it actually triggers the production of aldosterone through this renin-angiotensin system. So your kidneys produce renin because you have low blood pressure. You're hypotensive. Or you have hypotension. So what renin does is it takes a protein from the liver called angiotensinogen and it converts it into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is traveling through the blood and it gets converted into angiotensin 2 in the pulmonary capillaries and the renal capillaries. So capillaries in the lungs, capillaries in the kidneys. Now this requires an enzyme, this conversion, and that's angiotensinogen converting enzyme, or ACE. This is actually quite interesting because ACE receptors in the lungs are what coronavirus uses to get into your cells in your lungs. So it's odd. It's sort of like a strange little way that the coronavirus uses to sneak into your cells and cause pulmonary disease or pneumonia essentially. So it uses the receptors for angiotensinogen converting enzyme. We're also going to see angiotensinogen converting enzyme again when we do exam 3 and kidneys and diuretics. We'll worry about that later. But once we have our angiotensinogen 2, that is the whole point of all of this process, is we need angiotensinogen 2 because that goes to the adrenal cortex and it stimulates aldosterone. If you remember, we said that adrenal cortex, adrenocorticotropic hormone doesn't really stimulate aldosterone that much, even though aldosterone comes from the adrenal cortex. It's because it's angiotensin 2 that stimulates aldosterone. And aldosterone is made in a very specific part of the adrenal cortex, which is the zona glomerulosa, which you've learned in lab. Okay, so that is it for your hormone lecture. There are 2 videos that you need to watch along with thought questions and an associated little quiz, just like the first quiz with hyponatremia. There is just the endocrine system, and then there's one called the multiple endocrine neoplasia, which has to do with an endocrine disorder. So these are the videos and thought questions. associated with this lecture. Okay, and those are posted in the content folder in exam 1. Okay, that's it.